Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Jorn, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, William H., Augustus, and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dappo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, and Steve, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level, reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Leonard the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, and Frederick the Great. With that, I hope you enjoy this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Going back just a little bit to those revolutions of 1848, they had a flavor of some of the things that Marx was talking about. What did Marx think about all those revolutions?
So, consistent with what he argued in the Communist Manifesto, he believed that communism or socialism, getting past capitalism, would have to go through capitalism first. And so the revolutions to begin with were, the revolutions were almost shot through with, they were liberal revolutions, right? These were not communist or socialist revolutions. These were revolutions against the reactionary regimes that had either long been in place in Europe or that had, for example, in France, come into being after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. And so they were democratic, and Marx was highly in favor of them, not only because he was a small d Democrat, but also because he thought that if socialism was ever going to have any chance whatsoever, you had to go through a sort of liberal period in the society, and Prussia had not yet had a liberal period. In the middle of the revolutions, though, he changed his mind because, at least in Prussia, and I think this was true elsewhere, once the working class really sort of mobilized, the working class and also sort of remnants of the peasantry really mobilized with their feet during the revolution, many of the liberals, those who you might consider capitalists even, who might have been in favor of the revolutions to begin with because they wanted liberties for themselves, especially economically, that they weren't granted under the absolutist state. They sort of turned their backs on the revolution and thus sided with the absolutist state, monarchies in some cases, against the revolution. And at that point, Marx really soured on this notion that you could have a liberal period. And in fact, the defeat of those revolutions made him much more pessimistic. He spent much of the 1850s deeply pessimistic about the future of democracy or socialism or any of the things that he really wanted.
I think you paint a really good picture of the things that the groups like the church and the ancient regimes would really have a problem with: the small d democracy, the uh, being against the monarchy. As far as economics, did he have actual, what was maybe in simple form his prescriptions for what a post-capitalist society would look like, kind of from his mouth? Because it seems some of the reading that I've done, the second generation kind of had a different interpretations of what he said. But what would his prescription would have looked like?
So, well, if you take the Communist Manifesto, which I think he never really truly revised. I mean, he built upon it in many ways, but if you take that as a sort of like crystallization of his ideas, many of them were like what we would now consider social democratic ideas or democratic socialist ideas, like the socialization or even nationalization of like basic necessities, basic goods, education, for example, proponent of public education. But he did think that eventually, and he continued to argue this, especially in Capital, that eventually capitalism was headed in a direction of bigger and bigger combinations. So we could talk about like the rise of corporations. And these bigger and bigger combinations were going to, were making both economic distribution that much more efficient at the same time, because it was being done on the backs of the working class and the exploitation of the working class. It was also creating widespread misery. And he thought that in order to sort of like square this circle, the thing that had to happen is that the working class had to sort of take control of these corporations, that you didn't really need capitalists. You didn't need people making obscene profit in order to have such a system. And so obviously there are many ways and many sort of actual political valences to take this in. Soviets had reason to say that what they were doing in terms of state command of everything was in line with Marx, but also plenty of like syndicalists, even anarchists, would have argued that, or you know, like a worker co-op type thing could have argued that their ideas, workers sharing control over the means of production without any type of hierarchy, was also in line with Marx. I think Marx was more leaning towards the sort of like liberation side of socialism than he would have been towards the state command side of socialism. But, you know, that's one of those mysteries that we'll never know.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I read a bit about Karl Kautsky and some of those people who were almost sat at his feet, and they lived into the Soviet era, and they were fairly horrified with what happened in Russia and the Soviet Union. And it would be kind of interesting to see if Marx, because it does seem like they took some of Marx, but they took it in a different direction. Like you're saying, that anarchists also find a lot in Marx.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky, the anarchist relationship is a little bit tricky because he was against anarchists, specifically Mikhail Bakunin, who they were vying for control of the International Working Men's Association for a time. But like there's very little about the Soviet Union that I think is consistent with like Marx's philosophy, other than efforts to sort of collectivize the resources and the means of production, right? So, you know, again, it's one of those great unknowns. By saying this, you sound like you're just an apologist for Marx, but I have serious doubts there's anything about the Soviet Union that Marx would have liked. And I think Kautsky's a good example of somebody who worked hard to sort of follow in Marx's footsteps in ways. I think he was much closer to the late Engels than he was even to Marx, but that because he was horrified, that's sort of indicative.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. What other thoughts of socialism and schools of thought of socialism were going on at around the same time as Marx?
There was still this utopian strain of socialism that I think had serious roots in France, but also in the United States. You see this with, Robert Owen and the communities that he was trying to build in the United States, these sort of utopian communities. That strain remains strong. And then, really after the Paris Commune and then sort of leaning into the 1880s, the most powerful sort of epicenter of socialist or communist, not just thought, but politics was in Germany, in fact. And this would have been with the Social Democratic Party, which Kautsky for a long time was one of the lead thinkers of. And Kautsky becomes known as, so the German Social Democratic Party during the 1880s was kind of the most powerful party in what's known as the Second International, which was a sort of like international organization of socialist parties that tried to come together to organize across national lines, just like the International Working Men's Association had tried to do with Marx in the 1860s and 70s, which is why that group, sort of in retrospect, is known as the First International. Kautsky was probably for a time the intellectual or theoretical leader of the Second International, and he is known in retrospect as like an orthodox Marxist. And his main claim to fame is that he truly thought that it was inevitable that capitalism was going to morph into socialism, and he would argue this is what Marx argued. I don't think Marx ever argued it was inevitable, but that becomes known as orthodox socialism, and you get a lot of interesting political responses to that. One being that there's no need to sort of work for reforms now because that's just going to slow down the process in terms of transforming capitalism into socialism. And you have a serious challenge in Germany by Edward Bernstein, who's known then as a revisionist, because he argued that we can't know that for sure, but even if we do, it's our job to make the lives of the workers better here and now, even if doing so means that we have to make compromises with the system. We have to run candidates and elections and offer, if we can, reforms that are going to make their lives better now. These debates really sort of were at the heart of Marxism and socialism in the late 19th century, not just in Germany and Europe, but also in the United States.
That's so interesting that the argument between whether do we just let the thing go and it'll eventually wind up where in the utopia we want it to, or if we have to work to get to that almost has parallels in Christianity and religion as well.
So, yeah, I see Marxism as a secular philosophy, but because so many of Marx's followers across the last 150 years have been so devoted to him, there are a lot of parallels between the history of Marxism and I think the history of Christianity in that time period.
Did Marx himself have a strong opinion on not only religion, but maybe the state of religion at his time with the state religions and then the Catholic Church, which was one of the more powerful influences in his part of Germany? Yeah. What were his opinions on how they were operating?
It's interesting because he actually he wrote about so many different things, but he didn't write tons about religion. And when he did, people have really sort of keyed in on those. You know, the most famous saying, of course, that we've all heard many, many times is that he said that religion is the opiate of the masses. It's kind of a mistranslation, but what often gets left out of that when people restate that Marxist aphorism many times is that right afterwards he said something to the effect of, people need their opiates, right? The suffering need their opiates. He thought that religion was something that people who suffered in the world needed, to take their minds off the things that are causing the suffering. So he wasn't against people being religious, but he didn't believe in God or any of the gods. He didn't think that he thought humans would be better off if they were not religious. But he said the only way that would happen is if they didn't need it. So in other words, he thought that if we could have a socialist society in which people weren't constantly exploited, they wouldn't sort of go towards religion, right? With that, he pretty much hated organized religion. He hated the church, all the organized churches, the church leadership. When he spoke of them, it was usually as if they were extremely corrupt, in league with monarchs, dictators, politicians, capitalists, the people who oppose democracy. That's how he saw the church in any organized fashion, almost universally.
So it's really interesting. You see how I think you make the case, like you can see why in Europe and in that time that the church and the Marx would be diametrically opposed. But if we move across the ocean to America, it gets I think it's a little more blended up there. And I think for the modern person, it's a little more confusing that somebody like Lincoln and Marx would have a couple of points where they're sort of going in the same direction. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so much to say about that. So because he was writing, Marx started paying a lot of attention to things in the United States in the 1850s. He had always kept one eye on developments in the United States, as did a lot of European educated people, because it was different and interesting, and it seemed like a harbinger of things, no matter what your ideas or politics were. But in the 1850s, he paid a lot of attention there. One reason being simply that he was writing for the New York Tribune, and I think he was a professional, right? So he had to understand what his audience cared about. But the other being that many of his closest comrades from the 1848 revolution, so many of them ended up in exile. If they survived the revolution, they had to leave really the whole continent. So many of them ended up in London, but just as many, especially from Germany, ended up in the United States, and they're known as the 48ers. And these people, they actually had a lot of influence, especially in the Midwest, on politics in the 1850s leading into the Civil War. And so he kept up a lot of correspondence with these people throughout the 1850s, and it really informed his sense of what was happening in the United States. And as the Civil War was approaching, as the crisis was heating up, he paid even more attention to what was happening in the United States, and it started to give him actually a lot of renewed optimism. And so he actually looked to the Civil War and the abolition of slavery as his new sort of 1848 revolution that was going to pave the way for, it was going to create the momentum for larger things in his mind, eventually socialism, perhaps in the United States and Europe and maybe everywhere else. And so in this sense, he is deeply anti-slavery, both because it's wrong, but also, he's a Democrat. So like, what kind of small d Democrat is going to like slavery? I don't think it's possible. But he also believed, even as early as the 1850s, that what he called slavery in the black skin. So in other words, by enslaving Black people in the United States, he would weaken the position of the working class entirely by dividing it up. And so he thought that the abolition of slavery was a necessary precondition for the organization of the working class and for the development of a socialist consciousness.
Yeah, that's interesting, because slavery is obviously really horrific, but then the conditions of the working people in the factories in the northeastern cities, did he write much about that?
Yeah, I mean, he was in Capitol, because he worked on Capitol at the British Museum, the reading room in the British Museum. He mostly used evidence and statistics from what was happening in England, the factory system in England. But he knew that the factory system in the United States was similar. It was conditioned on very similar, it was a similar mechanism. And he knew that the American working class, most of whom he thought had been recent European immigrants, many from Germany, he knew that their lives were not great. And so he would call it wage slavery, right? And so it was it was a step up from chattel slavery for him, but it was not great. And so on the spectrum of slavery to freedom, it's not like quote unquote free laborers were all the way over on the free side. And he thought that if they were going to obtain freedom, they had to abolish slavery, because that was like an albatross for the whole working class.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Did Marx have ideas on actual policy, and did he have thoughts on policy prescriptions like in the U.S., things that sort of sound socialist, like free soil movements and the Republicans of that time, and free silver and silver standard? Did he have thoughts on actual policy minutia?
When it came to minutia, not really on policies, except during the Civil War. Like, he and Engels paid extremely close attention, especially early in the Civil War, to what Lincoln was doing and what his generals were doing. And so, for example, Marx became a big fan of James Fremont when he was the leader of the Western Front, because he had abolished slavery even in Missouri, which was a Union state. And Marx was critical of Lincoln because he reversed that policy. Marx was trying to placate the border states. So Marx argued consistently from the outset of the Civil War that the North, the Union, the United States, was going to win, but they could only win when the logic of the war became about the abolition, became about emancipation, because then you unlock these millions of people who are in chains to fight for you. And that's what happened, really. That is like one of the main reasons why the North eventually was successful, is because they made it about liberation after the Emancipation Proclamation. Marx had been writing about that from early on, and Engels was more attuned to the military side of things. And early on, the Confederacy seemed just better strategically, better tactically, and Engels was very pessimistic. And Marx said, just wait, because politically this is going to happen. And so, like when it came to things like free soil, he just thought that was kind of rhetoric. He was never somebody in his life who was like prone to like liberal rhetoric, and he would have considered that sort of liberal rhetoric. But because Lincoln was the president of the United States during the Civil War, he kind of admired him, and he admired the fact that somebody who was in many ways sort of ordinary compared to, like, a monarch at the time, or a dictator, or one of the Bonapartes at the time in France, who were very grandiose, that Lincoln, Marx wrote famously in a letter to Engels that the Emancipation Proclamation sounded like it was written as a summons by a lawyer. And it's true. He just thought that this was something incredible was happening in the United States, that a true sort of representative of the working people had become this extraordinary leader that was going to lead the nation to emancipation, and that was going to set the tone for a future revolution. He was and then would have been even more deeply unhappy with the results, but at the time he was pretty sanguine about Abraham Lincoln, even though they disagreed about some pretty fundamental things.
What were maybe some of the things that Lincoln and later the radical Republicans would have agreed with Marx on? And after Lincoln, did Marx have any sort of influence on later thought in American politics?
So some of the radical Republicans became something of socialists, right? When the Paris Commune happened, Wendell Phillips said, "We're all communists now." Was he an actual communist in the Marxist sense of it? Perhaps not, but he and many of the radical Republicans soon after the Civil War talked a lot about how now they had to turn their attention to the labor question, and their thoughts were, I would say, closer to socialism, closer to Marxism than they would have been to what became of the Republican Party by the 1880s or 1890s, right? So there was a lot of overlap there. Did Marx have influence in American politics? That's a different question. He started beginning in the 1870s and 1880s. His ideas began to have influence over some of the working class or socialist parties that began to develop at a very small scale, that eventually developed at a larger scale and became, for example, the Socialist Party of America in the early 20th century, Eugene Debs. That to me was a Marxist party, even though Debs and other leaders of that party tried very hard to couch Marxist rhetoric in sort of American vernacular. But the United States was also interesting in the late 19th and early 20th century when it came to the reception of Marx, because you had a lot of German immigrants who read Marx in alignment with perhaps the orthodox Marxism of the Karl Kautsky and the Second International. But you also had thousands and thousands of people in places like Oklahoma, former populists who were joining the Socialist Party and began reading Marx and learning about Marx. And to them, Marx was like a Christ-like figure. These were people who were evangelical Christians, or even elsewhere, social gospelites. You had a whole host of different types of Christians or American religious people who thought it was totally consistent for them to mix their Marxism and their Christianity. And at least at that period in Europe, that would have been a less common thing, especially in a place like Italy, where the left tended to be deeply anti-clerical.
That's so fascinating. I think, though, the last thing that maybe would help wrap us all up is in that time period of the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, did Marx's name in either Europe or the US, was it as polarizing as it is today?
Not as much as it is today. He would have been like a small scale polarizing figure within the movement, because there would have been people who were vying for power with their ideas within various movements who were trying to sort of crowd Marx out. Mikhail Bakunin being one of the most famous examples of that. But in terms of the polarizing figure that he later becomes, that he still is in the United States, especially, no. So a few years before he died, some New York. This was in the period after the Paris Commune, when his name began to be floated around as the idea, but the person creating the ideas behind the Commune, the person who was in charge of the International. A couple of American reporters traveled to London to interview him and meet with him, and they kind of treated him as somebody who was supposed to be demonized. But upon talking to him, they just seemed impressed by his wide knowledge of things. One reporter described a situation in which he sat down in his reading room and was looking at all these books and just couldn't help but marvel at the learnedness of Marx. So no, he didn't become what he would later become. And what he later became was, a product of the struggles of the 20th century.
Now, you have a book coming up on Marx. Is that geared towards a general audience, would you say?
That's the goal. It is an academically researched book that I'm trying to write that will appeal to more people outside of the academy for sure, because I think it's really interesting. And I think more than just academic historians will be interested in the story I have to tell.
Well, when that book's ready, we'll definitely share it. And because I'm definitely looking forward to reading it myself. I want to thank you so much for your time. I've learned a ton, and I feel like there's a lot more that I need to start digging into.
Well, thanks. I've enjoyed the conversation a lot.